Shenna has lots of posters and bumper stickers. We have agenda for tonight, minutes from last meeting up here, and sign up for Shenna here. So without further ado, Shenna Bellows, our candidate for U.S. Senate.
Thank you. Right here. That's my phone. So, good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Shenna Bellows, and I'm running for United States Senate because I think we need more courage and honesty in Washington. Now, it's really wonderful to be here in Rockland because about a month and a half ago, I celebrated my honeymoon here. My husband and I love film and decided to honeymoon at the Camden Film Festival, and we stayed at the Granite Inn here in town. And we've been living together for 3 years. We had vowed in 2009 that we would not get married until our gay and lesbian friends could get married. I was part of the leadership team of Mainers United for Marriage for 7 years until we finally passed marriage in 2012. And so then when the Supreme Court ruled in June, finally ending discrimination against same-sex couples across the state, then we got married and honeymoon in my living room in Manchester. I grew up in the town of Hancock outside of Ellsworth. My father is a carpenter. My mom stayed at home with the 3 of us kids. When I was in the 5th grade, she went to work at the local greenhouse and we were able to afford electricity. I worked my way through high school, through college. I was a Subway sandwich artist. I worked in the local lobster pound. I waited tables. I worked retail. And I share this with you because it informs who I am and why I'm running. In the last 18 years that Susan Collins has been in office, we've experienced an economic crisis, a constitutional crisis, and an environmental crisis that threaten our country's future. And I want to talk first about the economic crisis. When I graduated from college, I had enormous student loan debt. But I was fortunate because at that time, unemployment was very low across the country. Unemployment for young people was low. It was easy to find work. And student loan interest rates were lower then than they are now. And the cost of college was lower. These days, young people graduating from college in Maine face double-digit unemployment. And unemployment for the entire state is twice that, what it was in 2000. And they've changed the formula so that those who have been unemployed for a very long time are no longer counted in the statistics. I think that that is wrong. I'm very concerned about the budget shutdown, the sequester, the default debacle. Congress continues to lurch from economic crisis to economic crisis. My mom worked in that greenhouse that she started in when I was 11 for her entire life until age 49, when she realized she had no health insurance, she had no benefits, and she didn't think she could keep working doing physical manual labor until age 65. So she decided to go back to school. She got a degree through adult ed, and through the University of Maine system, she got a degree in nursing. And now she works at the night shift at the local hospital. So the good news is that she has health insurance. The bad news is, again, employment across the state is very difficult, and the only employment she's been able to find is the very difficult night shift. And there are layoffs continually at hospitals across the state. Our economy is in trouble, and we need change. We need people in Washington who understand what it's like on the ground, who are willing to work together toward long-term change. Which brings me to my background at the ACLU. For the last decade, I was executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Maine. I started out as an organizer against the Patriot Act in Washington, D.C. The mission of the ACLU is defense of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We had a saying at the ACLU that if you agreed with us 75% of the time, you should be a member, and if you agreed with us 50% of the time, you should be on the board of directors. And we said that because we had a principle of no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, just permanent principles grounded in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so we stood up against the Patriot Act We stood up against Real ID. We stood up against NSA spying and against the NDAA. And when the Republicans in the legislature took away same-day voter registration, we stood up for voting rights. I co-chaired the same-day voter registration referendum campaign in 2011. And with grassroots participation from this county and counties all across the state, we were able to restore our voting rights. I think we are facing a constitutional crisis in Washington that threatens our country's future. I think we need to repeal the Patriot Act. We need to stop spending billions of dollars and spying on Americans and start investing those funds in jobs, in healthcare, in services in our communities. Which brings me to the third issue. So growing up in Maine, anyone who hunts or fishes, farms or gardens, understands that the climate is changing, that we do face a looming threat in climate change, that our economy and our environment are integrally linked, that we depend on the health of the Gulf of Maine, that we depend on the health of our forests and our farms. We need transformative change in Washington to protect the environment, to confront climate change. Now, some politicians will tell you these challenges are impossible, that it's too difficult to take them on. People will say that it's too expensive, that it's too complex, that there's no hope. But what we showed here in Maine, time and time again, with the freedom to marry, with voting rights, with privacy, this last session we were one of 2 states in the country to pass a law protecting your cell phone communications. We showed time and time again that people can work together, that we can work together in Augusta to create meaningful, positive social change. That's what I'd like to do in Washington. Now, a friend of mine from Hancock County, he said to me, he said, why on earth would you want to do this? It's too corrupt. Why would you give up a job that you love at the ACLU and that security to take on this race and to go to Washington where the politics are so poisonous and so corrupt? And it's true. Carpenter's daughters do not run for federal office very often because these races cost millions. You either have to be a millionaire, that's why we have a Congress of millionaires, or you have to have the energy, the dedication to get out and talk to everyone all across the state. What I'm trying to do is do just that, to build a grassroots movement of Mainers all across the state who are willing to hope, to work together, to confront and fix our economy, to work toward constitutional freedoms, and to work toward environmental protection. That's why I'm running. So I'd love to go into questions. I think that's the most interesting piece of these conversations, and talk in the questions, hear what you're thinking about, hear what you're concerned about, and talk through that. I kicked off my campaign and went to all 16 counties in 1 week, and it was wonderful. I started in Ellsworth, where I went to high school, and then went down to Portland for a press conference at a brewing company run by some friends of mine. All across the state, I talked to entrepreneurs, I talked to farmers, I talked to small business owners, to Mainers about what they're interested in. So I invite you to ask your questions, ask me anything.
How many votes will it take to win the election?
So 312,000 if turnout is 61%. So I think that's fairly high for an off presidential election year, but given the excitement around the governor's race, I think that we can fully anticipate that there will be high voter turnout. So 312,000 votes. There are about 110,000 Democrats and unenrolled voters who consistently vote for the most liberal candidate in the race, or the Democrat in the race. There are about 80,000 Democrats who consistently voted for Susan Collins in previous elections. And then there are Republican libertarians who are very interested in my candidate and who have been signing up to volunteer and signing up to help because of my opposition to the Patriot Act, my support of marijuana legalization, my opposition to NSA spying. And then there are the unenrolled. I need about 40,000 unenrolled votes. So.
You forgot the Greens, there's about 34,000 of us.
You're right, I did. Shame on me. And I would like your support, please.
Yeah, you have mine.
Thank you. Other questions?
What are your environmental priorities?
Thank you for asking that. I think that climate change has to be number one. I think that we need to, and it's a matter of priorities in the budget, whether we're subsidizing fossil fuels and traditional sources of energy or whether we're making investments in cleaner energy. It's also about requiring new standards and being very assertive and aggressive in standards for emissions. But I think it's also, it's more than that. It's supporting science and supporting scientific research, supporting operations. So during my kickoff, I went and toured Bigelow Laboratory. And it was a wonderful experience. When I was in high school, actually, in college, I worked at the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. There are good research facilities all across Maine doing cutting-edge work, and we need to invest in those. So I think that those are the major priorities. Conservation is extraordinarily important as well. And I think that we need to amend, this is very urgent, it is unconscionable that fracking is exempt from the Clean Water Act.
Shenna, for the life of me, I cannot figure out why you're in such a hurry to join an organization that only has 9% popularity. Can you help me out in saying why you would want to join such an unpopular organization that has been accused of corruption and self-centeredness for the last 8 years? Help me out here.
Because the decisions that Congress makes have real consequences for people's lives here. The decision by Congress, for example, to cut SNAP benefits, the food stamps program. I went to a homeless memorial service just 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about the families that they're seeing and the increase in homelessness across Maine and increase in hunger across Maine. Decisions, for example, around Obamacare to compromise with insurance companies, to create provisions of that act that are really creating a lot of anxiety among Maine families and not go for universal single payer. The decision to, and then going back to constitutional freedoms, votes to pass the Patriot Act, to pass expansion of the Patriot Act time and time again, so that we're wasting billions of taxpayer dollars in spying on Americans. Those are decisions that Congress has control over that have real impacts on people's lives, and that's why I want to go there to organize. I'm an organizer at heart. I was an organizer in the Peace Corps in Panama. I was an organizer in the AmeriCorps in Nashville, Tennessee. I started out at the ACLU as an organizer. I think we need to build coalitions, really interesting coalitions, and work through an alternative, change. Go back to our constitutional freedoms, go back to civil rights, advance environmental protections, and restore economic opportunities. The Ag Bill, for example, is yet another example. USDA is just coming down with new regulations that treat small farmers. I was visiting with a farmer in Waldo County and then other farmers in Aroostook County. USDA is trying to treat the small farmers the same as the big agribusiness operations in the West. Those decisions that Congress makes affect people in our communities.
I have more of an observation than a question. When Obama ran in 2008, there was a well of support, enthusiastic, a spirit that you could almost feel. And when we had our caucuses in Camden, we filled the Opera House with 550 people. We turned people away. And that was true throughout the county and throughout the state. Had a tremendous turnout. And when I look at here tonight, what's here, I see more people at this meeting here than I've seen since Obama, I think. And I just wonder, and we've had other candidates at various times, this response to you seems to me to be really big. And with the same kind, I don't know if it's going to develop into the same thing that Obama had, but it certainly is a turnout that shocked me.
Thank you. Well, I've never been to your meeting before, so that's good feedback. Thank you very much. I'm not a traditional politician. I have not served in elected office. I am a member of the Manchester Conservation Commission because I care about conservation. But at the ACLU, I worked on policy change in the legislature with Dave Miramont, with your elected officials, and I'm passionate. I believe that policy does matter to communities, and we can bring people together and work that through.
You may have, just one other thing, you may have something you don't know yet.
Thank you. I hope so. That's how I'll win. There's a question in the back and then
Just,
Dave here.
you can do this however you like. You haven't mentioned foreign policy. If you go to the Senate, it's going to be very important.
Absolutely. So, when I was 15, I was an AFS exchange student to Brazil. I think AFS is a wonderful program, and anyone who knows it brings foreign exchange students from overseas
AFS parents.
here to this country to start educating young people from a very early age about different cultures and different perspectives, different worldviews. That was a phenomenal experience. I didn't speak a word of Portuguese. And my second day upon arrival, they placed me in a Brazilian high school, and there I was. And I learned very quickly because I like to communicate. When I was in college, I studied abroad again in Costa Rica. I was studying environmental science and economic development there. And then I did the Peace Corps in Panama for 2 years. I worked with artisans, ceramics artisans. We built together a micro-lending program in that community. And I taught adult ed classes, and I started a junior achievement program, which is an entrepreneurship program in the local high school. What I learned in my time overseas is that fundamentally, we all share basic human values. And it is extraordinarily important that the United States, as a leader in the world, advance the ideals that are contained in our Constitution, advance the ideals of human rights. I think the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and overseas, the spying on foreign leaders, the spying, the targeted drone killings, which have not been targeted at all, I think have done a tremendous disservice to us in undermining our national security, as well as undermining our international relations. And the spying is actually undermining our international commerce. There was a New York Times article today that talked about how companies overseas are increasingly reluctant to use United States technology because of concerns about security and surveillance. So I think in terms of foreign policy, it's really important. We cannot be isolationist, but we should be very hesitant to intervene militarily, especially without a multilateral support. So I think, I do think that what happened with the reversal of US policy in Syria recently is a testament to grassroots power, because it looked certain that we were going to go in to Syria. And the public rose up and communicated with our elected officials, and they heard us. I think that we need more deliberation and more consideration before we enter into that intervention. The foreign policy of the last 2 decades has been a disaster in almost every respect. It's been costly, it's cost our economy here at home, and it's been costly in terms of international security and our standing in the world.
I've got 3 questions, but I guess I want to start by saying that Susan Collins, someone told me when I was in California that it was Susan Collins who marshaled the act through Congress that pulled the rug out from the post office. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
The pensions issue, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent way in which you can possibly gain some traction there. And my second question was about the 2 unconstitutional laws, in my opinion, that we have. One of which is the fast track, which is about to expire, which violates, in my opinion, Article 2, which says that the Senate actually should approve treaties by 2/3 majority. And this, of course, allows majority of House and Senate to approve treaties, and that's how NAFTA and CAFTA and several other of the foreign trade treaties have been gotten through Congress. They wouldn't have passed under Article 2. And of course the other one is the debt limit, which hangs over our head. Every every time Hamilton attempt to get something, you know, they have to keep increasing it, which violates the portion of the 14th Amendment that says the national, the public debt shall not be questioned. So do you have any comments on those?
Sure. So the post office issue is one where the post office is required to put a certain amount of money into future pension payments, and that's reduced their ability in terms of their operating funds. And my understanding is that it's resulted in layoffs and it's resulted in reductions in the workforce and has really cost them financially. I think that one of the things that we forget in this country is that we have public goods. There are things that are not necessarily profitable, but that are still extraordinarily important. And being able to send and receive mail to every community in Maine, whether it's Gilead, where the Bishops are originally from, or whether it's, you know, my town in Hancock, it may not be profitable for my, you know, the mail that my parents sent to me when I was in Brazil may not have turned a profit for the U.S. Post Office, but having those connections with communities all across this country is a very important public good, and it's worth preserving. And I think time and time again, you see examples of infrastructure where that's the responsibility of government, where we need to be investing in that infrastructure that then becomes the platform for individual entrepreneurship. Another example is when I was traveling, so on the second day of my launch, the first day I went from Ellsworth to Portland to Lewiston and ended the day in Elliott, in York County. I got up at 2:30 in the morning to drive to Aroostook County for breakfast in Presque Isle, noontime in Piscataquis County, and then ended that night in Bangor. And from Presque Isle to Piscataquis County, I had an incredible difficulty accessing the internet, despite having a smartphone. And when I talked to folks, they said, well, you know, you can only get dial-up here. And then when I talked to people in Brooklyn, Maine, on Saturday night, they told me that in Brooklyn and Hancock County, they only have dial-up. So how is you know, in Piscataquis, there are 17,500 people. It's a very small population. So if you're an entrepreneur and you want to start a business, and perhaps you want to live in Dover-Foxcroft or the surrounding towns because of the way of life, but the infrastructure doesn't support your decision to communicate with people outside of the state, to market your product online in an effective way, that's a function that government should be serving. It's building that infrastructure that then becomes a platform for individual opportunity. Because how are we going to advance the economy in the rim counties of Maine if we don't have adequate infrastructure? And if we're not supporting the U.S. Postal Service in making sure that there's good communications. So in response to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade agreements, again, I don't think that we should be isolationist in our worldview, but I think that too often these trade agreements, and I'm very opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have sacrificed environmental and labor standards and benefited multinational corporations at the expense of working people. And we see it here in Maine, the export of jobs overseas, and at what cost, not only to us here in Maine, but also to the planet, when we're not raising labor standards and environmental standards across the world. And not necessarily benefiting those communities, you know, internationally either, but benefiting the profits of multinational corporations. So I think that is very concerning. And I'm blanking on your middle unconstitutional issue. I got your bookends.
The two were Article 2 and the 14th Amendment.
Oh, the default. You were talking about the debt limits. Yes. And this is where I share some. I would not have voted with Ted Cruz 3 times for the shutdown, which is what Susan Collins did before getting involved in the compromise. At the same time, I understand some of the angst on the part of members of the Tea Party about our extreme budget overages, particularly in funding of the surveillance military industrial complex. There are choices that we should make. We should be cutting spending in certain areas. We should be cutting, you know, I was reading about the large corporate subsidies through the Ag Bill that are benefiting huge corporations and the tax giveaways to these huge corporations. We definitely need to be making those adjustments, but that's in the appropriations process. That's in the budgeting process. Once Congress has appropriated the money, once Congress has spent the money it is irresponsible to suggest that we won't pay our bills. So I think that we're having the wrong conversation at the wrong time. So thank you for those questions. Dave?
I'll listen to one.
Okay. Yeah.
I just had a question. I was wondering if you think we can get rid of the governor, you know. I'm just so sick of him. I just can't take it.
I share your concerns. So we had an amazing coalition around issues of privacy, which are the Constitution and constitutional freedoms should not be partisan. And we were trying to pass legislation to prohibit domestic drone surveillance. We think the ACLU thought that drones shouldn't be flown over your private property without a warrant. And then we also had these bills, I organized this coalition to require law enforcement to get a warrant before accessing your text messages, your internet communications, or before tracking you via the tracking device that is your cell phone that you carry around with you. And LePage vetoed that. He vetoed the drone bill and he vetoed the cell phone tracking bill. And we had this amazing coalition. We had, some of his strongest supporters as well as progressives. And that was very frustrating to me. So I share your frustration and I share your hope that we'll have a new governor in 2014.
This isn't really a question, but it's a little bit kind of along the line of what Ed said. I just wanted to say what brought me here today, what made me want to come and hear you, is that there was a little piece I heard on public broadcasting, just a tiny little thing. I think you quoted something like that you said that we needed to listen to each other, and that also that if you really looked at it, our values are so much the same. And that's something I've always felt so strongly about. I work with a guy who just comes from a completely different background, and I'm an atheist, he's very Christian, and our values are just so close, with our family and caring about our children, and that just really resonated with me. So I wanted to tell you that just as a little insight.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Thank you.
I was going to ask how we can get over this Supreme Court decision, the Citizens United decision with campaign finance.
So, as a carpenter's daughter who does not have millions, I have to say that our campaign finance system is utterly broken and it threatens our democracy. It protects incumbents and it protects millionaires. And I think that's why our public policy is so weighted in favor of the few over the many. And so I think that we need a national clean election system. I think we need national same-day voter registration. And I think we desperately need campaign finance reform. And I think we should keep bringing it. So the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision against sensible campaign finance rules. Let's bring legislation back again and again. And, Justice Kennedy was the deciding vote, as he so often is, and this goes to my background at the ACLU. He has shown an evolution on some issues. He's definitely thinking about his legacy. I think that it would be a mistake not to try. I think we need to keep fighting for campaign finance reform. And I have to tell you, it's incredibly disturbing. The part of campaigning I like is getting out and talking to people. But there is also a requirement of getting on the phone and soliciting contributions. And when I first told my dad that I was going to run for office, he started saving. So on my very first day, he said, I have a check for you. It was the maximum contribution, which is $2,600. And so then my grandfather agreed to match it. So he agreed to give me $2,600 as well. And he's a little more well off than my dad. And he said to me, he's like, so this is all I can give you. And I said, well, that's for the primary, yes. You can give another $2,600 for the general. And he said, but ExxonMobil, they could give you millions if they wanted to. And I said, yes, if ExxonMobil decided that this independent progressive from Maine was environmentalist was who they wanted to support, they could spend millions either getting me elected or getting me defeated. And he said, that's just not fair. And I said, I know, Grandpa. And it is. It's horribly wrong with our system when individual citizens have a maximum contribution. Now, granted, that's a pretty high contribution, but large corporations can spend as much as they want. and cover up their tracks, you know. I said, Grandpa, you could start a super PAC. My grandfather, he's 93, he's not gonna start a super PAC. He's not a Koch brother.
Piggybacking on that idea, bigger than Citizens United is the effort of Move to Amend, which is to amend the Constitution, which declares unequivocally that corporations are not people and money is not speech. And presumably you would support that.
I'll be honest, as someone who has spent much of my career defending the Constitution, constitutional amendments give me some concern, and this one in particular, because I don't think that this court would interpret an amendment like that. I think they could use an amendment like that to prevent good organizations, groups like the ACLU or Planned Parenthood or the League of Women Voters, groups like the League of Conservation Voters, from speech, they could prevent family planning clinics potentially from talking about controversial issues. So I get very concerned about the unintended consequences of the constitutional amendment. I'm open to continuing to listen. A lot of my best friends, you know, a lot of people I care about, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, for example, of which I am a member, is a big supporter of a constitutional amendment. I really do think that we should continue to bring legislation, and we need to continue to bring the issue back in Washington. And you know, it's one vote on the Supreme Court that is standing in the way between meaningful campaign finance reform. And so that's where I come from. And I will say, probably everyone in this room, there's something that you've heard me say that you may not agree with, but I will say one thing. You'll always know where I stand. I'll always be honest about what I think, and I'll always be willing to listen to different points of view. It's part of who I am. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. Do we have time for one more, or do we need to cut it off?
Up to you.
One more question, and then we'll finish up.
Shenna, you talked about your interest in the environment. Do you have experience in any relations with Wabanaki people?
Yes. I worked with them, specifically leaders in the Passamaquoddy tribe. And this is a very difficult issue, but around the Elver issue, because you know, on the one hand, we have the Elver population, which is crashing, and the need for regulation. But the law that passed the legislature this year, precipitously, I think, resulted in charging dozens of Passamaquoddy people with criminal charges, and they're fighting that right now. And I testified at the time this is going to result in disproportionate incarceration of the Passamaquoddy people because of a dispute between the tribe and the state government. And I think that that's wrong. So I did work with them on that issue. I also worked with them on the issue of racial profiling. We had a bill in the legislature to prohibit racial profiling. And we were also supporting national legislation. And we reached out to the tribes, all of them in Maine, and said, is this something that is a problem for you, and is this something you'd like to support? And they said, yes, it's a problem for us. We do feel profiled. But then when they read the language, they realized that there were sovereignty problems in the federal bill. And so I advocated on their behalf to change the federal bill to recognize their sovereignty, to make sure that it wasn't an imposition on them of a particular structure. So I want to thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I look forward to continuing the conversation. My goal in this campaign is to build a truly grassroots movement, to go city to town, all across Maine. So there are a lot of different towns in this room. If you are connected to a group that might want to hear me speak, if you might want to have a house party, or you know an organization that might want to have me come and talk to them, I'd be very willing to do that. I have some bumper stickers here. I have some donation envelopes. So I know there are no ExxonMobils in the room, and and you may not have been saving a year for this campaign like my dad did, but just $25. One of my goals is to get a campaign donation from every town in the state, and if we can get 1,000 people to give $25, that's an organizer, and so on. And last but not least, if you are interested in where I'm going to be or what I have to say, please join my email list. So I look forward to staying in touch, and thank you very much.